It was just past sunset when Margaret Dawson heard the soft but insistent knocking at her front door. She wasn't expecting anyone. At her age, visitors were rare, and most people in the neighborhood knew better than to stop by unannounced. Still, something about the sound, small, hurried, almost desperate, made her pause. Margaret lived alone in the house she had called home for more than 50 years. It was a quiet neighborhood, mostly older folks like her, and by this hour, the streets were usually empty. She set down her knitting and carefully pushed herself up from her chair. Her joints ached, as they always did, but she ignored the discomfort as she made her way to the door. Another knock, louder this time. Margaret's heart picked up speed. She wasn't one to frighten easily, but something about this felt different. She reached for the chain lock before cautiously cracking the door open just enough to see outside. Two small faces stared up at her. They were children, twins, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing side by side on her porch. Their identical brown eyes were wide, filled with something that looked like fear and hope tangled together. They were dressed in mismatched clothes, their small hands gripping each other tightly. Margaret blinked, momentarily speechless. The boys looked exhausted, their cheeks smudged with dirt, their clothes slightly wrinkled as if they had been walking for hours. "Hello," Margaret finally managed, her voice uncertain. The twin on the left swallowed hard. "Please, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need help." Margaret's fingers tightened on the doorframe. A chill ran through her despite the warm, evening air. "What are you doing out here so late?" she asked, glancing around the porch. There was no sign of an adult nearby, no car idling on the curb. Just the two of them alone. The boy on the right shifted uncomfortably. We didn't know where else to go," he admitted. Margaret's heart squeezed. "Where are your parents?" The twins exchanged a look. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Then, finally, the first boy spoke again. "They're not coming back." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She opened the door wider, her instincts taking over. "Come inside, both of you." The boys hesitated for only a second before stepping over the threshold. Margaret shut the door behind them and turned on the hallway light, taking a better look at them now that they were in the warm glow of her home. Their shoes were worn, their hands slightly scraped like they had been running or hiding. "Sit down, sweethearts," she said gently, guiding them toward the couch. "Tell me everything." The twins sat, their small frames looking even smaller against the floral cushions. They didn't speak at first, just glancing at each other like they were silently deciding who should talk. Then, the first boy, his voice shaking, said something that made Margaret's stomach drop. "We're not supposed to be here. We weren't supposed to make it this far." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the phone. Something was very, very wrong. Margaret's fingers hovered over the phone, but something in the boys' eyes made her pause. They looked at her with a mix of fear and desperation, like they weren't sure whether they could trust her. She set the phone down slowly, trying to steady her voice. "Tell me what you mean, sweetheart," she said gently. The boy who had spoken before hesitated, his small hands gripping the edge of the couch. His brother glanced at him, then at Margaret, as if waiting for some kind of reassurance. She softened her expression, her years of being a mother and grandmother guiding her. "You're safe here," she said. "I promise." The boy took a shaky breath. "We weren't supposed to get out." Margaret's stomach twisted. She sat down across from them, her hands folded in her lap to keep from shaking. "Out of where?" she asked carefully. The boys didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, heavy and filled with things they weren't saying. Margaret noticed how their bodies were tense, their eyes flicking toward the windows as if they expected someone to burst in at any moment. Finally, the second boy spoke, his voice even softer than his brother's. "The place we were before. They told us we couldn't leave." Margaret felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had seen children in bad situations before. As a retired teacher, she had come across students with bruises they wouldn't explain, kids who showed up to school hungry, wearing the same clothes day after day. She had learned to recognize the signs of trouble. And these boys, they were in trouble. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Who told you that?" The first boy hesitated, his fingers tightening on the fabric of his jeans. The people who took us. Margaret's breath caught. She leaned forward just slightly, keeping her voice as calm as possible. Took you from where? The boys didn't speak right away. Instead, they glanced at each other again, their small hands still locked together. Margaret could see how tightly they were holding on, like they were each other's only anchor in a world that had turned against them. Finally, the first boy whispered, "We don't remember home." Margaret's chest ached at the words. She had so many questions, but she didn't want to scare them. They were already on edge, their little bodies still tense, as if they expected to be dragged away at any moment. She took a slow breath and forced a reassuring smile. "Well, you're here now, and you're not alone anymore." The second boy's lip trembled. "Are you going to call someone?" Margaret hesitated. Her instinct had been to call the police, but something about the way they asked made her pause. They weren't just afraid of being found. They were afraid of who would find them. She softened her voice. "Do you want me to?" The boys exchanged another look before the first one shook his head. "Please, not yet." Margaret could see the pleading in his eyes. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Okay," she said gently, "but I need to know what happened. If I don't call someone, I at least need to understand." The boys hesitated again, but then the second one, who had been quieter, finally spoke. "We got out through a window," he whispered. "We ran and didn't look back." Margaret's heart clenched. "And you came here? To me?" The first boy nodded. "We found something with your address on it. In the old lady's things." Margaret's breath caught. Old lady's things? Her mind raced. The only person who had lived in this house before her was her sister, Eleanor. She had passed away years ago, but Eleanor had never mentioned knowing any children, much less having anything that could have led them here. She studied the boys again, searching their faces for something, anything, that could make sense of this. "Did you know my sister?" she asked carefully. The first boy bit his lip, then shook his head. "No, but we think she knew the lady we were with." Margaret's heart pounded. She wasn't sure what was more shocking, that these boys had somehow escaped from somewhere they weren't supposed to leave, or that her own past might somehow be connected to whatever they had run from. She took another deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Did she hurt you?" Both boys shook their heads quickly. "No," the second one whispered. "She was nice to us, but she was scared, too." Margaret's fingers curled against her lap. "Scared of what?" The first boy hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it, he said, "The people who took us." Margaret felt her hands go cold. She had been expecting something bad, but this was worse than she had imagined. She forced herself to stay steady. "Do you know their names?" "Where they are?" The second boy shook his head. "We only knew what they called themselves, and we only saw them sometimes." Margaret's mind was spinning, but she kept her voice soft. "And the lady you were with?" "The one who knew my sister." The first boy hesitated, his small hands gripping his jeans again. Then, finally, he whispered, "She's gone." Margaret's breath caught. She looked at their little faces, saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the fear in their posture. Whatever had happened, it had left them alone, scared, and running for their lives. And now, somehow, they had ended up here. Margaret swallowed hard, pushing past the lump in her throat. She couldn't panic. Not now. She reached for the blanket on the back of the couch and draped it over their small shoulders. "You're safe here," she said again. "I promise." The boys didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, the first one leaned into his brother's side, their small bodies finally relaxing just a little. Margaret exhaled and stood, her mind racing. She didn't know what she had just stepped into. But one thing was clear. These boys had come to her for a reason. And whatever had happened to them, whoever had taken them, was still out there. Margaret barely slept that night. She had made up the guest bed for the boys, tucking them in with extra blankets and promising them that they were safe. But even after they finally drifted off, she found herself pacing the small living room, her thoughts tangled with questions that had no answers. Who had taken them? How had they ended up with a woman who somehow knew her sister? And what did they mean when they said they weren't supposed to get out? She sat by the window, watching the street, half expecting someone to come looking for them. The boys had been terrified when they arrived, watching the door, flinching at every little sound. Whoever had kept them didn't just let them go. They had escaped. And Margaret had a terrible feeling that someone might be searching for them, even now. She thought about calling the police again. That was the logical thing to do. But logic didn't always mean safety. She had seen it too many times. Children slipping through the cracks, their stories ignored or misunderstood. The fear in their eyes told her that calling the wrong person could send them straight back into the hands of whoever they had run from. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Margaret rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in, but she knew she couldn't rest. Not until she had some answers. Early the next morning, she made the boys' breakfast, pancakes and scrambled eggs, something warm and filling. They ate quickly, like they weren't used to having full meals. It broke her heart to watch. As they finished, she sat across from them at the kitchen table. "Sweethearts," she said gently, "I need you to help me understand. I want to keep you safe, but I have to know more." The boys exchanged another one of their silent looks before the first one. She was starting to think of him as the braver one. Spoke. "She told us to come here," he said softly. "The woman who took care of you?" He nodded. "She said, if something happened, we should come find you." Margaret felt a chill crawl over her skin. "Why me?" The boy hesitated. "She had letters," he finally admitted. "From your sister." Margaret's breath caught. Letters. Eleanor had passed away nearly a decade ago. She had never mentioned anything about children, much less a connection to someone who had been hiding them away. But if there were letters, real letters, then there was a missing piece of this story that Margaret had never known about. "Did you bring them?" she asked carefully. The boy shook his head. "We didn't have time." Margaret's stomach tightened. That meant they were still out there, wherever they had come from. And if someone went looking, they might find them. She kept her voice calm. "This woman, did she ever tell you how she knew my sister?" The second boy, who had been mostly quiet, finally spoke. "She said she owed her." Margaret's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. Owed her? She thought back to her sister's life, trying to remember anything that could explain this. Eleanor had been a kind soul, always helping others. She had worked as a nurse for years, often going out of her way to care for people who had nowhere else to turn. Had she saved this woman? Helped her in some way? Margaret glanced at the boys again, watching their small faces, their tired eyes. No matter how this started, it had ended with them being trapped somewhere, waiting for a chance to escape. She exhaled slowly. "Sweethearts," she said softly. "Do you remember where the house was?" The first boy hesitated. Sort of, he admitted. "It was far. We ran for a long time before we found a ride." Margaret's stomach twisted. "A ride?" The second boy nodded. "A truck driver. He let us sit in the back, but he didn't ask questions." Margaret's chest tightened. These two had been running for miles, jumping into trucks, finding their way to a stranger's door, just because of a name on an envelope. The weight of it hit her all at once. How small they were, how much they had been through, how alone they had been until now. She reached across the table, gently placing her hand over theirs. "You don't have to run anymore," she said softly. The first boy swallowed hard, but he nodded. Margaret sat back, thinking. If they had come from far away, it meant she couldn't just start asking around town. Whatever they had escaped from wasn't her neighborhood. It was somewhere beyond, maybe even another state. That complicated things. She needed those letters. If there was even a chance that Eleanor had left something behind that could explain all of this, she had to find it. But that meant going back. And Margaret had a feeling that whoever had lost these boys wouldn't just let them go. The rest of the day passed slowly. Margaret let the boys rest, gave them fresh clothes from a box of things her grandkids had left behind. She didn't ask them any more questions, not yet. She didn't want to push them too hard. But that night, as she sat by the window again, watching the darkened street, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe yet. And she had no idea what she was going to find when she started searching for the truth. Margaret woke before the sun, her mind already racing. Sleep had been fleeting, her thoughts tangled in the mystery of the boys and the letters they spoke of. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake them, and poured herself a cup of coffee. The warmth did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She knew what she had to do. The boys had escaped from somewhere dangerous enough that they had run for miles, hitched rides with strangers, and arrived on her doorstep clutching nothing but fear and a name. If she wanted answers, she had to find the house they came from. But going back meant stepping into the unknown, and Margaret wasn't sure what she was walking into. She glanced toward the small couch where the twins were still curled up under thick blankets. Their faces looked peaceful in sleep, but she knew better. Beneath the surface, there were scars, some she could see, others buried so deep they might never fully fade. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. Her heart pounded in her chest. No one ever came by this early. Setting her cup down, she moved to the door slowly, pressing her ear against the wood. Silence. Then another knock, firmer this time. She swallowed hard. Was it them? Had someone come looking already? Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to see outside. A man stood on her porch. He was tall, dressed in a plain jacket, his hands tucked into his pockets. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that sent a ripple of unease through her. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Sorry to bother you so early." Margaret kept her grip tight on the door. "Can I help you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying her. "I was wondering if you've seen a couple of kids around here. Twin boys about yay high." He held up his hand at chest level. "They went missing not too long ago." Margaret's breath caught. She forced her expression to stay neutral. "Missing?" she repeated. He nodded. "Yeah, their guardian's real worried about them." The way he said the word guardian made her skin prickle. It didn't sound right. Margaret knew she had to tread carefully. Lying outright could be dangerous, but telling the truth, that could be worse. She gave a small shake of her head. "Haven't seen any kids." The man studied her for a long moment, and she could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "Well," he said, stepping back, "if you do, give us a call. We just want to make sure they're safe." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, creased card, placing it on the wooden railing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into a dark sedan parked at the curb. Margaret watched as the car pulled away, waiting until it was completely out of sight before she grabbed the card. There was no name, just a phone number. She shut the door and locked it, her hands shaking. The boys were in danger, and now so was she. She turned back to the living room, where the twins were now awake, watching her with wide, fearful eyes. "They were here, weren't they?" the first boy whispered. Margaret nodded. "But I told them I hadn't seen you." The second boy swallowed hard. "They won't stop looking." Margaret knelt in front of them, her voice steady but firm. "Then we need to move fast." She wasn't going to let them be taken back. Not when everything in her gut told her that wherever they had come from was no place for a child. She needed those letters, and she needed to find the truth before the truth found her. Margaret moved quickly, her heart pounding as she gathered a small bag with essentials. If those men were looking for the twins, they wouldn't just stop after one visit. She didn't know who they were, but something in their presence, in the way the man had spoken, sent alarms ringing in her mind. The twins sat close together on the couch, their small hands gripping the blanket like it was the only thing grounding them. They were scared, but they weren't crying. Margaret had noticed that about them from the start. They didn't cry, not the way kids usually did when they were afraid. Whatever had happened to them before they arrived on her doorstep had taught them to stay silent, to hold it in. She kneeled in front of them. "We have to leave," she said gently but firmly. "It's not safe here anymore." The boys exchanged a glance. The older one, by just a few minutes, he had mentioned, nodded slightly. "Where will we go?" Margaret exhaled, rubbing her hands together as she thought. "I know a place," she said. She wasn't entirely sure where yet, but she couldn't tell them that. She just knew they had to get far away. She started packing quickly, throwing a few extra clothes for them into a bag. The moment she zipped it up, there was another knock at the door. Her body went rigid. It was too soon. The twins froze. Their eyes darted toward the door, their hands gripping each other's sleeves. Margaret gestured for them to stay put and moved toward the window instead of answering. Slowly, she peeled back the curtain, just enough to see outside. This time, it wasn't just one man. There were two dark SUVs parked outside, engines still running. 3 men stood near the porch, one of them checking his watch. They weren't wearing uniforms, but something about them screamed authority, or at least the kind of authority that didn't need a badge to get what they wanted. Her stomach dropped. They weren't just looking for the boys. They were here to take them. Margaret turned back to the twins. She kept her voice low and steady. "We're leaving through the back." They didn't argue. They didn't ask questions. They just nodded, moving with the kind of quiet urgency that no child should ever have to learn. Margaret grabbed the bag and led them to the kitchen, where the back door opened into a small yard. She had lived in this house for decades, but she had never felt so unfamiliar with it, as if it had turned into a trap overnight. She peeked out. The alley behind her house was empty, but that didn't mean they were safe. "Stay close to me," she whispered. The twins clung to her sides as they slipped through the door, their feet barely making a sound against the ground. Margaret shut the door gently behind them, locking it as if that would buy them time. They moved quickly through the yard and into the narrow alleyway. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows across the pavement. Margaret's mind raced. She had a car, but it was parked out front, right in view of the men standing outside her house. Taking it wasn't an option. They needed to get far enough away before those men realized they were gone. Margaret's old friend, Helen, lived a few blocks over. Maybe she could help. But as they turned the corner, heading toward a quieter street, the younger twin suddenly tugged on her hand. "Wait," he whispered. Margaret stopped, her breath catching. "What is it?" The boy hesitated, his small fingers tightening around hers. "I remember something." She crouched down to his level. "What do you remember?" His brother was watching him closely, his expression unreadable. "The letters," the boy whispered. They weren't just letters. They were. A car engine roared from behind them. Margaret's head snapped up. Headlights flashed down the alley. The SUVs were moving now, slow and deliberate, like they were searching. She didn't wait to hear the rest. "Run." She grabbed their hands and took off, her pulse hammering in her ears. The boys didn't ask questions. They ran. Margaret had never run so fast in her life. Margaret's breath came in short gasps as she pulled the twins along, her old bones protesting with every hurried step. The alley behind them was still bathed in the glow of the SUV headlights, creeping closer like a predator closing in on its prey. They couldn't afford to slow down. She turned sharply at the next intersection, leading them through a narrow passage between two buildings. Her mind raced. Helen's house was still a few blocks away, but they needed somewhere to hide now. Up ahead, an old church stood at the corner of the street, its side entrance barely lit by a single flickering bulb. It had been years since Margaret had stepped foot inside, but she didn't hesitate. With a final burst of energy, she ushered the boys toward the door, pushing it open just enough for them to slip inside before pulling it shut behind them. The air was cool and still inside the dimly lit space. Wooden pews stretched toward the altar, their worn edges a sign of decades of prayers whispered in both desperation and hope. Margaret's heart pounded in her ears as she crouched with the twins behind the last row, waiting. Outside, tires screeched against the pavement. Margaret held her breath. The twins huddled close, their small hands gripping her sleeves. The footsteps came next. Slow, calculated. Right outside the church, a shadow passed over the stained glass windows. Then another. The men were searching. They knew they had lost them, but they weren't giving up. Margaret's grip tightened around the twins. She silently prayed that the heavy wooden doors would be enough to keep them safe. Minutes passed, then more. The footsteps finally faded. Margaret let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. The older twin tugged at her sleeve, his wide eyes staring up at her. "Miss Margaret," he whispered, "we have to go to the police." Margaret frowned. "Sweetheart, we don't know who we can trust." The younger twin swallowed hard. "We do now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something Margaret hadn't noticed before, a flash drive. She stared at it. "Where did you get that?" He looked down. "It was in Mama's things. I didn't know what it was before, but I think it's why they're after us." Margaret's heart sank. Everything was starting to make sense. The strange men, the coded letters, the reason these boys were running for their lives. This wasn't just about them. This was about something much bigger. She took the flash drive, holding it tightly in her palm. Whatever was on it had cost their mother her life. And now, It was the only thing keeping the twins from meeting the same fate. "We can't run forever," the older twin said quietly. Margaret knew he was right. She looked toward the doors, listening carefully. The silence outside stretched long and deep. The SUVs were gone. For now, Margaret turned back to the boys, her decision firm. "Come on," she whispered. "We're going to find someone who will listen." And with that, she led them back into the night, holding on to the one thing that could finally bring the truth to light. Margaret held onto the twins tightly as they stepped back into the night, her pulse steady despite the fear still lingering in her chest. The church had given them a moment of safety, but they couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed help, real help. And for the first time, they had something tangible to prove that the twins weren't just running from shadows. She knew exactly where they had to go. Helen had a son, Marcus, who worked in law enforcement, but more importantly, he was someone Margaret trusted. He had always been the kind of man who listened, who did what was right no matter the cost. If anyone could figure out what was on that flash drive and make sure it got into the right hands, it was him. With quick, careful steps, Margaret guided the boys through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where the SUVs had last been seen. The air was thick and still, as if the entire city was holding its breath. The twins stayed close, their small hands gripping onto her sleeves, their trust in her unshaken. After what felt like hours, they reached Helen's house. It was a small, modest home with a porch light that flickered, a sign of its age. Margaret knocked lightly, her fingers trembling only slightly. The door opened almost instantly, and Helen's eyes widened at the sight of them. "Margaret," her gaze dropped to the boys, then back up. "What on earth?" "No time to explain here," Margaret said, urgency thick in her voice. "We need Marcus." Helen didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside and ushered them in, locking the door behind them. The living room was warm, smelling of cinnamon and old books. It was a place of comfort, a place of safety, but Margaret knew that comfort was temporary. Marcus arrived within the hour, dressed in plain clothes, but carrying the presence of a man who had seen too much in his line of work. His brow furrowed when he saw the boys, but he didn't question their presence. Instead, he turned to Margaret. "Tell me everything." Margaret took a deep breath and did exactly that. She told him about the twins knocking on her door, about the strange men who had come looking for them, and about their mother's final warning. Then, she handed him the flash drive. Marcus stared at it for a long moment before pulling out his laptop. He inserted the drive, his expression unreadable as files loaded onto the screen. The room fell silent. Lines of documents appeared, some labeled with official government markings, others filled with names and numbers that made no immediate sense. But as Marcus scrolled, his expression darkened. "This is bad," he murmured. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "How bad?" Marcus exhaled sharply. "Bad enough that I know why someone would kill to keep this quiet." He looked at the twins, his gaze softer now. "Your mom, she found something she wasn't supposed to." The older twin nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said she had to tell the truth, even if it was dangerous." Marcus pressed his lips together. She was brave. Margaret saw something shift in his expression, then a determination, a sense of duty. He closed the laptop and stood up. "I need to get this to the right people. This isn't just about the boys anymore. If this information gets out, it could take down people who have been untouchable for years." Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Are you sure you can trust them?" Marcus met her gaze. "Not all of them, but I know who to go to." The weight of the moment settled in the room. The twins sat quietly, processing everything. They were just children, but they had been forced to carry a burden no child ever should. Helen placed a warm hand on Margaret's shoulder. "They can stay here as long as they need." Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you." Marcus gathered his things, tucking the flash drive safely into his pocket. "I'll handle this," he said. "But Margaret, this isn't over. These men, whoever they are, won't stop just because we have the truth. You need to be careful." Margaret nodded. She knew that, but she also knew that running forever wasn't an option. The only way to keep the twins truly safe was to make sure the people hunting them had nowhere left to hide. As Marcus left, the twins finally spoke again. "What happens now?" the younger one asked. Margaret looked at them, seeing the weight of their past in their eyes, but also the strength their mother had given them. She took their hands in hers. "Now," she said gently, "we wait for the truth to do what it always does." The older twin tilted his head. "What's that?" Margaret gave them a small, reassuring smile. "Come to light."